Admiral Chester William Nimitz stood at the window of his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the scarred harbor. 6 months had passed since that infamous day in December 1941, when Japanese bombs had shattered America's Pacific stronghold, and the sting of defeat still burned deep. But intelligence reports crossing his desk suggested something monumental was brewing in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The morning briefing on June 2nd, 1942, brought disturbing news. Lieutenant Commander Joseph John Rockford, head of Station Hypo, the Navy's cryptanalysis unit, burst into the room with decoded Japanese transmissions. His eyes were bloodshot from countless sleepless nights spent breaking enemy codes, but his voice carried unmistakable urgency. "Admiral, they're planning something big," Rockford announced, spreading decoded messages across the polished conference table. "Operation Midway Initiative. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself is orchestrating it. They want to draw out our remaining carrier fleet and destroy it completely." Nimitz studied the intercepts carefully. The Japanese plan was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Yamamoto intended to strike at Midway Atoll, a strategic outpost 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. The attack would serve as bait, forcing the weakened American Pacific Fleet into a decisive confrontation where Japan's superior numbers could crush what remained of American naval power in the Pacific. "How confident are we in these intercepts?" Nimitz asked, knowing that the fate of the Pacific theater might hang on this intelligence. 90% certain, sir," Rockford replied without hesitation. "We've been tracking their communications for weeks. For aircraft carriers, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, they're bringing everything they have." The gravity of the situation settled over the room like a heavy fog. Japan's combined fleet represented the most powerful naval force ever assembled. Their carriers had struck with devastating precision at Pearl Harbor, then swept through the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and the Philippines like an unstoppable tsunami of steel and fire. According to the Naval or College Review's comprehensive analysis of Pacific Theater intelligence operations, Station Hypo's code-breaking efforts provided the crucial advantage that would determine the battle's outcome. Admiral Yamamoto's reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. The architect of Pearl Harbor was methodical, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. His strategy was sound. By threatening Midway, he would force Admiral Nimitz to commit his remaining carriers to defend this vile outpost. Once the American fleet sailed into his carefully prepared trap, Yamamoto's superior numbers would ensure total victory. But Rockford's intelligence breakthrough had given the Americans something precious: a knowledge of their enemy's intentions. Nimitz realized that this battle would not be fought on Yamamoto's terms, but on ground of America's choosing. "Gentlemen," Nimitz said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command, "we have been given an unprecedented opportunity. The Japanese believe they are setting a trap for us, but perhaps we can turn their own snare against them." The admiral moved to the large Pacific map dominating one wall of the briefing room. His finger traced the shipping lanes and strategic positions surrounding Midway Atoll. "If we can position our forces correctly, use the element of surprise, we might just achieve what many consider impossible." As dawn broke across the Pacific on June 3, 1942, the great naval powers began their final preparations for what would become the most decisive carrier battle in naval history. The fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, enveloped the Pacific Ocean like a vast black shroud. 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's First Air Fleet cut through the swells with deadly purpose. His 4 aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu represented the elite of Japanese naval aviation, their flight decks crowded with the same aircraft that had devastated Pearl Harbor. Just 6 months earlier, Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, reviewing the morning's attack plans. His confidence was absolute. Intelligence reports suggested the Americans had at most 2 carriers in the area, possibly 3. Against this for veteran flat-tops and their experienced air crews, victory seemed assured. The rising sun would witness another triumph for the Empire of Japan. 300 miles to the northeast, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the USS Yorktown coordinated with Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance. On the USS Enterprise, the American force seemed pitifully outnumbered, just 3 carriers against Japan's 4, with air crews hastily trained to replace losses suffered in the Coral Sea engagement weeks earlier. Many of the pilots climbing into their cockpits that morning had fewer than 50 hours of carrier experience. The Yorktown herself bore scars from her recent battle damage, patched together in 72 hours by Pearl Harbor's determined repair crews. Under normal circumstances, she would have required months in dry dock, but these were far from normal times. Every available aircraft and pilot had been pressed into service for what everyone understood might be America's last stand in the Pacific. At 0 for 30 hours, the first phase of Yamamoto's master plan began. 108 Japanese aircraft rose from the carrier's decks, their engines roaring in perfect formation as they turned toward Midway. Leading the attack was Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, a veteran pilot whose squadrons had participated in numerous victorious campaigns throughout the Pacific. The defenders of Midway had been expecting this moment. Radar operators detected the incoming formation at 0520 hours, still 93 miles away. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as every available American aircraft scrambled skyward to meet the threat. The island's mixed bag of defenders, Marine Corps aviators flying outdated Brewster Buffalo fighters, Army Air Forces pilots in their Boeing B-26 Marauders, and Navy torpedo bombers represented America's determination to fight against overwhelming odds. The official history of Marine Corps aviation in World War II documents the heroic, but ultimately futile defense put up by Marine Fighting Squadron to 21 during the initial attack on Midway. The aerial battle over Midway unfolded with savage intensity. Marine Captain Marion Eugene Carl led his Buffalo fighters against the superior Japanese Zeros, knowing his aircraft were hopelessly outclassed, but fighting nonetheless with desperate courage. The sky filled with tracers, smoke, and falling aircraft as the two forces clashed in mortal combat. Despite the defenders' gallant efforts, Tominaga's bombers reached their targets. Explosions rocked Midway's installations as Japanese bombs found their marks. Fuel storage tanks erupted in towers of flame. The command post took direct hits, and the airfield was cratered with devastating precision. Yet somehow, the island's runways remained operational, and many of its facilities survived the onslaught. As Tominaga's aircraft turned back toward their carriers, the lieutenant made a crucial radio transmission that would alter the course of the battle. There is need for a second attack wave. The message crackled through the morning air, intercepted by American radio operators who immediately understood its significance. Admiral Nagumo faced a critical decision aboard the Akagi. His reserve aircraft had been armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for potential naval targets, but Tominaga's request suggested these should be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for another strike against Midway's installations. At 0715 hours, Nagumo made the fateful choice to rearm his reserve aircraft for a second land attack. As Japanese deck crews worked frantically to change ordnance, they unknowingly opened a window of opportunity that would soon prove decisive. Unknown to the Japanese, American scout planes had already spotted their fleet, and Fletcher's carriers were preparing to launch their own strike force into the morning sky. The flight deck of USS Enterprise hummed with controlled chaos as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey prepared his dive bomber squadron for launch. The morning of June 4th had brought crystal clear skies and calm seas, perfect flying weather. That would soon witness one of naval aviation's most crucial moments. McCluskey, a veteran pilot with ice water in his veins, checked his instruments one final time as his Douglas SPD Dauntless was positioned on the catapult. Admiral Spruance had made the bold decision to launch his strike force earlier than planned, gambling that the Japanese carriers would be caught in their most vulnerable moment. With aircraft refueling and rearming on deck, the timing was critical, too early, and the American planes might not find their targets. Too late, and Nagumo's fighters would be airborne and ready to massacre the incoming attackers. At 0702 hours, the first American aircraft began launching from Enterprise and Hornet. The launch sequence was a marvel of coordinated precision, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighter escorts roaring off the flight decks in rapid succession. Within an hour, 116 aircraft were airborne, heading toward the Japanese fleet's last known position. The scene aboard Admiral Nagumo's flagship Akagi presented a study in organized confusion. Deck crews worked feverishly to rearm the reserve aircraft with land attack bombs, while the returning Midway strike force circled overhead. Low on fuel and waiting for permission to land, the hangar decks were cluttered with ordnance, fuel lines, and aircraft in various states of preparation. At 0728 hours, everything changed. A Japanese scout plane reported sighting American naval units to the northeast, including what appeared to be at least one aircraft carrier. The message hit Nagumo's bridge like a thunderbolt, forcing him to confront the nightmare scenario he had hoped to avoid: enemy carriers within striking distance while his own fleet was caught unprepared. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive 15-volume history of United States naval operations in World War II provides detailed accounts of the split-second decisions that determined Midway's outcome. Nagumo's dilemma was agonizing. Should he launch immediately with whatever aircraft were ready, or wait to properly prepare a coordinated strike? His air operations officer, Commander Minoru Genda, urged immediate action, but Nagumo hesitated. The indecision would prove catastrophic. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet was approaching. The Japanese fleet from the southwest, flying obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers without fighter escort. Waldron's men faced impossible odds. The squadron commander had sensed this might be a one-way mission, leaving behind a letter for his wife that began, "If this letter reaches you, I will have given my life for my country." At 0920 hours, Waldron's 15 torpedo bombers swept in toward the Japanese carriers at wave-top height. The sight that greeted them was both magnificent and terrifying for massive aircraft carriers. Surrounded by a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, their decks black with aircraft, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, veteran Zero fighters led by experienced pilots, dove to intercept. The slaughter was swift and merciless. One by one, Waldron's lumbering torpedo bombers were shot down by the superior Japanese fighters. The Devastators, already obsolete when the war began, stood no chance against the nimble Zeros. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 aircraft were destroyed, their crews lost to the Pacific's depths. Yet Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice was not in vain. Their low-level attack had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the higher altitudes undefended. At 0955 hours, as the last of Waldron's torpedo bombers was shot down, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's dive bombers approached from 15,000 feet above. The Japanese carriers spread below them like toys on a pond, their decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, a perfect target for dive bombing attack. McCluskey's radio crackled to life, "Attack immediately. Enemy carriers in sight." The moment of decision had arrived. The fate of the Pacific War would be determined in the next 10 minutes. At exactly 0955 hours on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey gazed down from 15,000 feet at a sight that would haunt Japanese naval officers for generations. Spread across the blue Pacific below were Admiral Nagumo's four aircraft, carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, their flight decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, completely defenseless against attack from above. The irony was devastating. While Japanese Zero fighters had descended to sea level to massacre the American torpedo bombers, they had left the upper atmosphere completely undefended. McCluskey's 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers held the perfect tactical position, and the enemy had no idea they were there. "This is it, boys," McCluskey transmitted to his squadron. "Remember your training. Make every bomb count." The attack began with mathematical precision. Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, selected the flagship Akagi as his primary target. The massive carrier was turning into the wind, preparing to launch aircraft, when Best's section screamed down from the sky at a 70-degree angle. His 1,000-pound, armor-piercing bomb struck near the bridge, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the hangar below. The explosion triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. The Akagi's hangar deck was packed with armed and fueled aircraft from the returning Midway strike force. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed from a symbol of naval supremacy into a blazing wreck. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie led his bombers from USS Yorktown against the carrier Soryu. 3 direct hits turned the ship into an inferno. Aviation gasoline ignited in massive fireballs that shot hundreds of feet into the air, while secondary explosions rocked the vessel. From stem to stern, the carrier Kaga suffered an even more devastating fate: multiple bomb hits. From Enterprise's Bombing Squadron 6 ignited fuel and ordnance throughout the ship. Commander Takahisa Amagai, the Kaga's air operations officer, later described the scene as hell on earth, with flames reaching temperatures that melted steel and turned brave men into shadows on bulkheads. The Japanese Naval General Staff's post-war analysis, declassified in 1963, admitted that the loss of 3 fleet carriers in 10 minutes represented the single most catastrophic defeat in the history of the Imperial Navy. In those 10 crucial minutes, the strategic balance of the Pacific War shifted dramatically. 3 of Japan's most experienced aircraft carriers were burning wrecks, taking with them hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots and aircraft mechanics. The cream of Japanese naval aviation men who had trained for years and fought in campaigns from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies were dead or dying. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, surrounded by smoke and flame, watching his carefully planned operation disintegrate before his eyes. The flagship was listing badly, her steering destroyed by the bomb hits. Reluctantly, he transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara, leaving behind the burning hulk that had been his command for so many victorious campaigns. But the battle was far from over. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had been operating separately from her sisters and escaped the initial attack unscathed. Her air group commander, Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi, immediately began preparing a counterattack against the American carriers. Captain Tomio Kaku of the Hiryu understood that his ship now carried the entire burden of Japanese hopes. With 3 carriers burning and sinking, Hiryu's aircraft represented the only chance to salvage victory from disaster. At 11:00 hours, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from Hiryu's deck, guided by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi toward the American fleet. The Americans had won the opening round decisively, but they knew the Japanese would not surrender easily. Admiral Fletcher, aboard the scarred Yorktown, prepared his defenses for the inevitable counterattack. His radar operators scanned the skies nervously, knowing that somewhere out there, Japanese bombers were racing toward them with vengeance in their hearts. As smoke columns from the burning Japanese carriers rose thousands of feet into the clear Pacific sky, both fleets prepared for the next phase of what was already being recognized as the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar. The tide had turned, but the final outcome remained uncertain. Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi led his 18 Aichi D-3A dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters through the clear Pacific sky, their destination the American carrier fleet detected by Japanese reconnaissance. The veteran pilot, flying from the only remaining operational Japanese carrier Hiryu, carried with him the hopes of the entire combined fleet and the burning desire for vengeance. After witnessing 3 sister carriers transform into flaming pyres, at noon on June 4, 1942, radar operators aboard USS Yorktown detected the incoming Japanese strike force. At 46 miles distance, the scarred carrier, hastily repaired after her mauling at the Coral Sea, immediately began launching additional fighters while her crew prepared for battle. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered all unnecessary personnel below decks as the ship's claxons wailed their urgent warning. The Yorktown's combat air patrol, reinforced by fighters from Enterprise and Hornet, climbed desperately to intercept the Japanese formation. Lieutenant Commander John Smith Thatch, leading Fighting Squadron 3, employed his innovative thatch-weave defensive maneuver against the superior Japanese Zeros. The aerial dogfight that erupted at 12,000 feet was a swirling melee of tracers, smoke trails, and falling aircraft. Despite the American fighters' best efforts, several Japanese dive bombers broke through the defensive screen. Takahashi himself led the attack on Yorktown, his aircraft screaming down at a nearly vertical angle toward the carrier's flight deck. The American anti-aircraft fire was intense. Every gun aboard the ship and her escorts filled the sky with deadly metal, but the Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. The blast killed dozens of sailors instantly and started fierce fires in the hangar deck below. Within minutes, black smoke was pouring from the carrier's wounds while damage control parties fought desperately to contain the spreading flames. The 3rd struck near the island's superstructure, destroying radar equipment and communications gear while starting additional fires. For a terrifying moment, Yorktown lay dead in the water, listing to port and burning from multiple wounds. Naval War College historians, in their comprehensive analysis Carrier Warfare in the Pacific, noted that Yorktown's damage control capabilities proved superior to their Japanese counterparts, enabling rapid repairs that seemed miraculous to outside observers. But the crew of USS Yorktown had not survived the Coral Sea battle only to surrender at Midway. Chief Water Tender Charles Clansmith led his damage control teams into smoke-filled compartments, risking their lives to restore power and control the flooding. Within an hour, the remarkable efforts of Yorktown's crew had the carrier making 20 knots and operating aircraft again. The Japanese strike force, having delivered their attack, attempted to return to Hiryu. However, the American Combat Air Patrol exacted a terrible price during their withdrawal. Of the 24 aircraft that had attacked Yorktown, only 6 bombers and a fighter survived to reach their carrier. Takahashi himself was among the casualties, shot down by American fighters during his escape attempt. Admiral Fletcher, wounded during the attack on his flagship, transferred tactical command to Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise. The decision proved prescient, As Yorktown was about to face an even more severe test, Japanese reconnaissance had spotted the seemingly crippled carrier and reported her as heavily damaged and probably sinking. This intelligence prompted Admiral Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu to launch a second strike. After 30 hours, 10 torpedo bombers escorted by 6 fighters launched from Hiryu's deck, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway. Tomonaga's aircraft had been damaged during that earlier mission, his fuel tank punctured by American defensive fire, but he volunteered for what everyone understood would be a one-way mission. The second Japanese attack approached Yorktown from a different angle, coming in low to deliver torpedo attacks against the carrier's hull. The ship's defenders, already exhausted from their earlier battle, prepared once again to fight for their lives. Captain Buckmaster ordered maximum speed and began desperate evasive maneuvers. As the Japanese torpedo bombers bore down on his command, at 2:45 hours, Tomonaga's aircraft began their final approach, skimming just above the wave tops as American anti-aircraft fire reached toward them. With desperate intensity, the fate of USS Yorktown and perhaps the entire battle hung in the balance. As the wounded carrier struggled to evade the deadly torpedoes racing toward her hull, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga's damaged torpedo bomber approached USS Yorktown through a hurricane of anti-aircraft fire, his fuel gauge showing empty and his aircraft riddled with holes from the morning's battle over Midway. Behind him, now another Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers from the carrier Hiryu skimmed the Pacific waves. At masthead height, their deadly Type 95 torpedoes armed and ready for what would prove to be the final act of their carrier's war. At 14:45 hours on June 4, 1942, the Japanese torpedo planes split into 2 groups to execute a classic anvil attack on the struggling American carrier. Despite the heroic efforts of her crew, Yorktown was still showing visible signs of damage from the earlier dive bombing attack. Her speed reduced and her defensive fires weakened by casualties and equipment failures. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered hard left rudder and maximum available speed, but the carrier's evasive maneuvers came too late. The Japanese torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side in rapid succession, the explosions tearing massive holes in her hull below the waterline. The carrier immediately took on a severe list to port as thousands of tons of Pacific seawater rushed into her engineering spaces. The explosion added to the chaos already consuming the ship, but could not diminish the courage of her crew as they fought to save their vessel. The torpedo attack had achieved what the dive bombers could not mortal damage to one of America's precious fleet carriers. Within minutes, Yorktown was listing at 26 degrees and losing power throughout the ship. Reluctantly, Captain Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship, believing his command was beyond salvation. But even as Yorktown's crew took to the life rafts, Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise was preparing the final American strike against the sole remaining Japanese carrier. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, despite his earlier heroics, was too low on fuel to lead another mission. Command of the strike fell to Lieutenant Earl Gallagher from Enterprise and Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie from the still operational Yorktown aircraft that had landed aboard other carriers. According to declassified Japanese naval records examined by historian Gordon Prange, in his definitive work Miracle at Midway, Admiral Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu recognized that his ship was now the sole target for American revenge and prepared for what he knew would be a final battle. At 16:45 hours, 24 American dive bombers found the Hiryu steaming at high speed toward the northwest, desperately trying to escape the fate that had befallen her 3 sister carriers. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, knowing his ship was doomed but determined to sell her dearly, had ordered every available Zero fighter into the air for a last-ditch defense. The aerial battle that followed was brief but savage. American fighters engaged the Japanese combat air patrol, while the dive bombers pressed home their attack against the fleeing carrier. Additional hits followed with devastating precision. The carrier's aviation gasoline stores ignited in towering explosions that could be seen for miles across the Pacific. Within minutes, the last operational ship of Nagumo's once mighty carrier force was burning from stem to stern, her flight deck buckling under the intense heat, and her aircraft exploding in sympathetic detonations. Admiral Yamaguchi, knowing his ship was beyond salvation, chose to go down with his command. His final radio message to Admiral Yamamoto read simply, "Hiryu damaged and on fire. We are preparing to ram an enemy carrier." It was a gesture of defiance from a defeated but unbroken warrior. By sunset on June 4th, all 4 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers were either sunk or sinking. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu had already disappeared beneath the Pacific waves, taking with them hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots and thousands of tons of aircraft and equipment. The Hiryu would follow them to the bottom before dawn. As darkness fell over the Pacific battlefield, both fleets assessed the day's catastrophic losses. Japan had lost the heart of her carrier aviation in a single day's fighting, while America had proven that courage, intelligence, and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned decisively, though bitter fighting lay ahead. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Yamato far to the west, received the reports of disaster with stoic resignation. His carefully crafted plan to destroy the American Pacific Fleet had instead resulted in the gutting of Japan's own naval aviation. The path to Tokyo Bay now lay open to American forces, and the Empire of the Rising Sun would never again enjoy the naval supremacy it had wielded so effectively since Pearl Harbor. The morning sun of June 5, 1942, rose over a Pacific Ocean forever changed by the previous day's epic battle, where Admiral Nagumo's proud carrier force had steamed with confident purpose. Just 24 hours earlier, only oil slicks and floating debris marked the graves of her fleet carriers and thousands of Japan's finest naval aviators. The strategic balance of World War II had shifted decisively in a single day of combat. Admiral Chester William Nimitz received the preliminary battle reports at his Pearl Harbor headquarters with characteristic restraint, but those present noted the visible relief in the Admiral's bearing. The intelligence gamble had paid off beyond his most optimistic hopes. Not only had the Japanese been denied their objective of crushing America's remaining carrier strength, but Japan's own carrier aviation had been devastated beyond repair. USS Yorktown, abandoned and listing heavily after the torpedo attack, became the focus of desperate salvage efforts. The destroyer USS Hammond came alongside the seemingly doomed carrier, providing power and pumping equipment as damage control teams reboarded their ship. For 36 hours, the crew fought courageously to save their vessel, gradually reducing the list and restoring partial power to the wounded carrier. Their heroic efforts were interrupted at 0609 hours on June 7th, when Commander Yahachi Tanabe's submarine I-168 penetrated the destroyer screen. For torpedoes from the Japanese submarine struck both Yorktown and Hammond, the destroyer sinking immediately with heavy loss of life, while the carrier finally succumbed to her accumulated damage. The submarine's attack provided a bitter reminder that the war was far from over. The strategic bombing survey conducted by the United States after Japan's surrender concluded that the Battle of Midway represented the decisive turning point in the Pacific War, marking the beginning of Japan's irreversible decline. The human cost of victory had been severe for both sides. Japan lost approximately 3,000 officers and men, including many of her most experienced carrier pilots, whose training required years to complete. The loss of veteran aviators proved even more devastating than the destruction of the ships themselves, as Japan's pilot training programs could not replace such experienced personnel. America suffered lighter casualties, 307 killed, but mourned heroes like Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron and the gallant men of Torpedo Squadron 8. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of both Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation, recognized immediately that his strategic objectives had been shattered. The plan to eliminate American carrier strength had instead cost Japan the core of her own naval aviation. More critically, the myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, lay in ruins on the Pacific floor alongside the sunken carriers. Emperor Hirohito received news of the disaster in his private chambers, the official reports euphemistically describing severe damage to the carrier force. The reality was far worse than the sanitized briefing suggested. Japan's advance across the Pacific had been permanently halted, and her forces would now face the prospect of fighting a defensive war against increasingly powerful American forces. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. American industrial capacity, already mobilizing for total war, now had the breathing space necessary to produce the ships, aircraft, and trained personnel that would drive Japan back across the Pacific. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet, veterans of the Midway triumph, would lead that advance alongside new Essex-class carriers, already sliding down American shipyard ways. For the men who fought at Midway, the battle's significance was deeply personal. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose navigation skills and tactical decisions had been crucial to American victory, received the Navy Cross for his heroism. Many others, living and dead, earned recognition for their courage during those decisive hours when the fate of nations hung in the balance. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, who had fought so gallantly to save his ship, eventually commanded other vessels in the Pacific campaign. His crew's damage control efforts aboard Yorktown became legendary throughout the Navy, studied by subsequent generations of naval officers as an example of professional excellence under extreme pressure. As the smoke cleared over the Midway battlefield, both combatants understood that June 4th, 1942, marked a fundamental shift in the Pacific War's trajectory. Japan's 6-month rampage across the Pacific had ended forever. Ahead lay the long, bloody campaign that would carry American forces from one island to another, ever closer to the Japanese homeland. The Battle of Midway had proven that intelligence, courage, and determination could triumph over superior numbers and experience. In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a handful of American carriers and their brave crews had turned the tide of history, ensuring that freedom's light would continue burning in the darkness of global war. The strategic initiative had passed permanently to America, never to return to Japanese hands.